I'm Captain Lena Preston, 34, a Delta Force operator who's spent the last decade running missions no one's allowed to talk about. For years, I wrote the plans that kept others alive, staying invisible so the work could succeed. But when my own operation was stolen and presented without my name at Norfolk Base Command, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or underestimated by people you quietly built up? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I arrived at Norfolk Base Command a week before the joint operation briefing, uninvited, technically, but under orders that didn't go through the usual channels. The kind of orders that come through encrypted phones and unmarked envelopes, the kind that don't leave paper trails or email receipts. I'd been doing this long enough to know when a mission required silence before it even began. The briefing room was standard military fare, fluorescent lights that hummed too loud, walls the color of old concrete, a long table surrounded by chairs that had seen better decades. Maps were already spread across the surface when I walked in, satellite images pinned to corkboards, and a projector waiting to flicker to life. The room smelled like burnt coffee and floor polish. They looked up when the door opened. 7 officers, all men, all in crisp service dress uniforms with polished insignia that caught the overhead lights. Their conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes tracked from my boots to my face, lingering on the uniform I wore, an older cut, the kind that hadn't been standard issue in years. No visible insignia except a subdued patch on my shoulder and a nameplate that clearly didn't ring any bells. One lieutenant, young enough that his face still had the smoothness of someone who'd never seen real combat, let out a short laugh. Looks like she found that in a museum. Another officer, a captain with commander's stripes I didn't recognize, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Who cleared her?" I stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, letting the silence stretch. No one stood. No one extended a hand. No one asked my unit or my name beyond what they could see stitched above my breast pocket. Preston. Just Preston. The colonel at the head of the table, Harris, according to the nameplate propped in front of his seat, glanced at me with the kind of look that said he'd already made up his mind. Not hostile, exactly. Just dismissive. The polished, institutional arrogance of men who think they know exactly who belongs in rooms like this and who doesn't. "Captain," he said, the word flat and obligatory. "You're early." "Sir," I replied, stepping inside and letting the door close behind me with a soft click. "We weren't expecting additional personnel until tomorrow's briefing." "I'm aware, sir." He waited for me to elaborate. I didn't. His jaw tightened slightly, but he turned back to the table, gesturing toward an empty chair near the far end, away from the maps and the center of conversation. "Take a seat. We'll begin shortly." I walked to the chair, my boots barely making a sound on the tile floor. The others had already returned to their conversations, voices low but not low enough. I caught fragments, probably admin. Logistics oversight. Not on the roster. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and waited. This wasn't new. I'd been in rooms like this before, where my presence was a question mark no one wanted to answer. Where assumptions filled the gaps faster than facts ever could. The lieutenant who'd made the museum comment leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking at something his neighbor said. I didn't look at him directly, but I saw it in my peripheral vision. The casual cruelty of someone who thought the joke was harmless because I wasn't worth the consideration. A young sergeant entered with a stack of folders, distributing them around the table. When he reached me, he hesitated, glancing back at Colonel Harris as if waiting for confirmation. Harris gave a barely perceptible nod, and the sergeant set a folder in front of me without meeting my eyes. I opened it. Standard briefing materials, mission parameters, logistical summaries, personnel rosters. Nothing classified, nothing that required the kind of clearance I carried but couldn't display. I scanned the pages with practiced efficiency, noting discrepancies, outdated intel, gaps that would need to be addressed. The door opened again. An admiral entered, Vice Admiral Clayton Reeves, though I recognized him before I saw the stars on his shoulder boards. I'd seen his face in classified debriefs, heard his voice on secure channels, but we'd never been in the same room. He was older now, gray at the temples, lines deeper around his eyes. The kind of wear that comes from decades of decisions that don't make it into public record. The room stood immediately. I rose with them, hands at my sides, shoulders back. "Gentlemen," Reeves said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who didn't need to raise it. "At ease." We sat. He moved to the head of the table, setting down a leather portfolio and scanning the room. His eyes passed over me without pause, without recognition. "Not yet. We have 48 hours before full operational briefing," he began. "I want preliminary assessments ready by 1800 tomorrow. Colonel Harris, you'll coordinate with intelligence and logistics. Captain Delaney, I need updated satellite imaging by morning. Lieutenant Parker," the lieutenant who'd made the museum comment straightened in his seat, "you'll verify personnel clearances and ensure everyone attending the briefing is vetted through proper channels." "Yes, sir," Parker said, his voice crisp. Reeves continued down the line, assigning tasks with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. When he reached the end of the table, when his gaze finally landed on me, he paused. "And you are?" "Captain Preston, sir." "Unit?" I held his gaze. "Cleared through JSOC, sir." "Orders routed through unconventional channels." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "Not here. Not in front of the others. You'll report to Colonel Harris for integration into the operational framework." "Understood, sir." He moved on, but I felt the shift in the room. The others had heard unconventional channels and drawn their own conclusions, none of them correct, all of them dismissive. Special projects. Administrative overflow. Some bureaucratic checkbox that didn't matter. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Maps were referenced, timelines discussed, contingencies outlined. I listened without speaking, taking mental notes of everything they got wrong, everything they'd overlooked, everything that would need to be corrected when the real briefing began. When Reeves dismissed them, the room emptied quickly. Officers gathered their folders and left in clusters, voices rising as soon as they reached the hallway. I stayed in my seat, closing the folder in front of me and waiting for the room to clear. Colonel Harris lingered near the door, speaking quietly with another officer. When they finished, he turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "Captain Preston." "Sir." "I'll need your full credentials before tomorrow's briefing. Chain of command, supervising officer, operational clearances. Everything." "It's already been provided through appropriate channels, sir." "Then I'll need it again." "Through me." I nodded once. "Understood." He left without another word, and I was alone in the briefing room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The maps on the wall showed terrain I'd memorized years ago. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice reminded me why I'd spent so long in the shadows. Because the moment you step into the light, people start asking questions. And some questions don't have answers they're cleared to hear. I stood, straightened my uniform, and walked out into the hallway where the laughter was already starting. The briefing began at 0900 sharp. I arrived 10 minutes early and stood in the back of the room, away from the cluster of officers gathered near the front. The projector was already warming up, casting a pale blue glow across the wall. Someone had brought donuts. A box sat open on the side table, half empty, powdered sugar dusting the surface. Colonel Harris stood at the front, reviewing notes on a tablet while others filtered in. Lieutenant Parker was there, along with the captain from yesterday and several faces I hadn't seen before. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who belonged, who knew their place in the hierarchy and didn't question it. When Admiral Reeves entered, the room snapped to attention. He waved them down immediately and moved to his seat at the center of the table. "Let's get started. Colonel Harris, you have the floor." Harris stepped forward, tapping the tablet to bring the first slide onto the screen. A map appeared: Eastern Europe, a small border region I recognized immediately. My pulse didn't quicken. I'd trained myself years ago not to react. "Gentlemen," Harris began, What you're about to see is the result of 6 weeks of intelligence gathering and operational planning. This is a joint task force operation designed to extract a high-value target from hostile territory with minimal footprint and maximum efficiency. He clicked to the next slide. Another map, this one more detailed, showing infiltration routes, exfil points, safe houses. My routes. My exfil points. My safe houses. I felt my jaw tighten. Harris continued, his voice smooth and practiced. The operation will utilize a 3-phase approach. Phase 1, insertion via low-altitude helicopter drop at 0200 local time. Phase 2, ground movement to target location using pre-established cover identities. Phase 3, extraction by armored convoy to secondary exfil point. Every word was mine. Every detail lifted directly from the classified Delta Force outline I'd written 2 months ago in a windowless room at Fort Bragg, surrounded by maps and satellite feeds, and the kind of silence that comes from knowing your work will never have your name on it. I'd spent 4 weeks developing that plan. I'd run scenarios, consulted with intelligence analysts, coordinated with foreign contacts whose names would never appear in any official record. I'd accounted for weather patterns, local security forces, and the 17 different ways the operation could go sideways. And now Colonel Harris was presenting it to Admiral Reeves like he'd built it from scratch. The next slide showed personnel assignments. Tactical teams, support units, command structure. My command structure, rearranged just enough to put Harris at the top. I waited. 3 more slides. 4. He was using my contingency plans now, the backups I designed for scenarios that wouldn't appear in standard operational doctrine. When he paused to take a sip of water, I spoke. That operation isn't yours to present. The room went silent. Every head turned. Harris lowered his water bottle slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something colder. Excuse me. I stepped forward, out of the shadows at the back of the room and into the light of the projector. The operational framework you're briefing, it's not your work. Harris's eyes narrowed. Captain Preston, is it? Yes, sir. And you're basing this accusation on what exactly? On the fact that I wrote it 2 months ago. Every phase, every contingency, every detail you've presented. A murmur rippled through the room. Lieutenant Parker exchanged a glance with the officer beside him. Someone coughed. Admiral Reeves leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Colonel Harris set down his tablet with deliberate care. Captain, I don't know what unit you're from or what channels brought you here, but this operation was developed by my team over the past 6 weeks. If you have concerns about overlap or similar operational thinking, you can address them through proper channels after this briefing. There's no overlap, sir. It's the same plan. Word for word in some sections. His jaw tightened. Who exactly are you, Captain? He dragged out my rank like an insult, like a reminder that I was beneath him in this room, in this chain of command, in this moment. I held his gaze. Captain Lena Preston. Currently assigned to your unit, Captain. What unit? I paused. Admiral Reeves hadn't moved, but I felt his attention sharpen. The others were watching now, waiting for me to stumble, to reveal myself as someone who didn't belong. I'm not at liberty to specify, sir. My orders came through JSC with operational security classifications that then you're not at liberty to challenge the work presented in this briefing. Harris's voice had an edge now, the polished veneer cracking slightly. If you have concerns, submit them in writing through your chain of command. Until then, Captain, I suggest you observe and learn. Observe and learn. Like I was fresh out of officer candidate school. Like I hadn't spent the last decade doing things that would never make it into his sanitized briefings. I caught my reflection in the window behind him, a figure in an old uniform, no patch visible from this angle, and a name that didn't belong to their roster. And I realized they'd already decided. Not just Harris. All of them. I didn't matter. Not the work I'd done. Not the missions I'd run. Not the plans I'd written in rooms they'd never see. I took a step back. Understood, sir. Harris returned to his briefing without another glance in my direction. The slides continued. My work, presented as his. My strategies, repackaged and delivered to an admiral who would approve them without ever knowing where they came from. I stood in the back and watched in silence as they stole everything I'd built. When the briefing ended, Admiral Reeves asked 3 questions, all of them about logistics I'd already solved. Harris answered smoothly, referencing his team's analysis and extensive coordination. Reeves nodded, satisfied. "Good work, Colonel. Finalize the operational order and have it on my desk by 1600. "Yes, sir." The room emptied in the usual controlled chaos, officers gathering tablets and folders, clusters forming in the hallway, voices rising as soon as they were clear of Reeves's presence. I stayed. Harris noticed. He approached slowly, his expression somewhere between annoyance and curiosity. "Captain Preston." "Sir. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'd advise you to be very careful. False accusations against a superior officer, it's not false, sir, can result in disciplinary action. Do you understand?" I met his eyes. "Yes, sir." He studied me for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "Dismissed." I walked out into the hallway where the laughter was already starting. Through the glass panel in the door, I heard someone say, "Who even is she?" No one answered. Because no one knew. And that had always been the point. Rewind. Before Norfolk. Before the briefing room and the stolen plans and the museum jokes. Before any of it. I'd spent a decade operating under Task Force Green. Delta Force, though we never used that name in the field. We didn't use names at all most of the time, just call signs, frequencies, and the kind of shorthand that develops when your life depends on the person next to you understanding exactly what you mean with 3 words or less. My first call sign was Ghost 6. 6 because I was the 6th member assigned to the unit when I joined. Ghost because that's what we were, shadows moving through places that didn't exist on any official map, doing work that would never make it into after-action reports or commendation files. We operated under assumed names, burned IDs, and walked into countries where our presence would have sparked international incidents if anyone had known we were there. Embassy parties where I wore evening gowns and carried intelligence devices in my clutch. Border crossings in vehicles that looked civilian but had armor plating hidden beneath the paint. Safe houses in cities where I spent weeks building cover identities that would dissolve the moment the mission ended. No publicity. No parades. No paperwork that survived longer than the time it took to shred it. I'd served beside men who now wore medals in briefing rooms like the one at Norfolk, men who'd sworn never to speak of me or our unit. Not because they didn't respect what we'd done, but because revealing it would compromise operations that were still running, still saving lives, still keeping threats from reaching American soil. We were the black ink that redacted names from official reports. The classified footnotes that explained why certain missions succeeded when they shouldn't have. The reason other units could operate cleanly, because we'd already done the dirty work no one wanted to acknowledge. In Kandahar, during an operation that officially never happened, I'd been part of a 4-person team extracting an intelligence asset from a compound controlled by forces I still can't name. The plan was simple: in at midnight, out by 0200, minimal contact. It went sideways in the first 10 minutes. The asset wasn't where he was supposed to be. The compound had twice the security we'd been briefed on. And the exit route we'd planned was blocked by vehicles that hadn't been there an hour before. We adapted. That's what Ghost Team did. We adapted, improvised, and survived when the mission parameters fell apart. We found the asset in a basement room, bound and barely conscious. We carried him out through a route I mapped while the team leader provided suppressing fire from a position that shouldn't have been defensible. We were 50 meters from the exfil point when the fragment hit my leg. I didn't feel it at first, just the impact, like someone had kicked me hard enough to throw off my stride. Then the pain came, sharp and spreading, and I realized I was on the ground and the asset was screaming and someone was dragging me backward while rounds sparked off the wall above my head. The team leader's voice came through the comms, calm and precise. Ghost 6 is hit. Continuing to exfil point. Prepare for emergency extraction. I remember thinking, clearly and distinctly, that I couldn't let them leave me. Not because I was afraid of being captured, though I was, but because if I was captured, if they found my ID and traced it back to Task Force Green, It would compromise every operation we'd ever run and every operator who'd ever served with us. So I stayed conscious. I pressed my hand against the wound and felt blood seeping between my fingers and forced myself to move when they pulled me to my feet and half-carried me to the vehicle waiting at the exfil point. The medic worked on me in the back of the truck while we raced through streets that blurred into streaks of light and shadow. He cut away my pant leg, applied pressure, started in 4 with hands that barely shook despite the vehicle bouncing over potholes and debris. He saw the tattoo then. On my right wrist, just below where my watch usually sat. A small, precise symbol, no words, no obvious military marking, just the kind of ink that could pass for decorative if you didn't know what it meant. But he knew. Every Delta operator carried the same mark, placed during a ceremony that didn't appear in any official record. It was our identification, our proof, our silent acknowledgement of the brotherhood we'd joined. The medic met my eyes. "You're gonna be fine, 6. I was. The fragment had missed the major arteries. The leg healed, eventually, though I walked with a slight limp for months afterward. The scar remained, a jagged line on my right thigh that I could trace with my fingers when I needed to remember why I did this work. The tattoo remained too. Hidden beneath my watch, beneath long sleeves, beneath the anonymity I wore like a second uniform. No name, no branch, no glory. Just the mark of those who did what others couldn't. After Kandahar, I ran 17 more operations. Some in the Middle East, some in Eastern Europe, one in South America that went so far off the books it didn't even have a code name. I built networks, gathered intelligence, and once spent 3 months undercover as a journalist in a country where being discovered would have meant immediate execution. I earned commendations I'd never see, medals that were recorded in files I'd never access, and the respect of operators who would never be able to publicly acknowledge what we'd accomplished together. When I was promoted to captain, the ceremony lasted 5 minutes in a windowless office. No family present, no photographs, no champagne toast afterward. Just a supervisor I'd never see again handing me new insignia and saying, "Well done, Ghost 6. That was 3 years ago. I'd taken a temporary assignment at Fort Bragg after that, doing operational planning for missions I wouldn't personally run. Training the next generation of Ghost Team operators. Writing the kinds of detailed plans that would keep them alive when everything went wrong. The Norfolk operation was supposed to be my return to the field. A joint task force mission that required someone with my specific skill set, someone who could blend operational planning with on-ground experience, who understood both the strategy and the execution. I'd written the plan in 4 weeks, accounting for every variable I could identify and several I'd learned to expect from experience. I'd submitted it through encrypted channels to a supervisor whose name I still didn't know, and I'd received confirmation that it had been approved for use in the joint operation. What I hadn't known, what no one had told me, was that my plan would be laundered through a film where my work was still displayed. Lieutenant Parker said something that made 2 others laugh. The sound was muffled, but clear enough. "Who even is she?" I didn't move. Didn't react. Didn't let the sting show on my face even though there was no one in the hallway to see it. I'd learned a long time ago that the ones who talk the loudest have the least to prove. The ones who need everyone to know their accomplishments are usually the ones with the thinnest resumes. Real operators, the ones who'd been downrange, who'd felt the weight of lives depending on their decisions, they didn't need to broadcast it. But still, the sting stayed. Years of silence. Years of anonymity. Years of missions that ended with flag-draped caskets instead of press releases, with classified debriefs instead of award ceremonies, with handshakes from people who would forget my name 5 minutes after I left the room. I'd accepted that. I'd chosen it, even because the work mattered more than the recognition. Because keeping operations secure meant keeping operators alive. Because the moment you start caring more about credit than mission success, people die. But standing in that hallway, listening to officers mock the uniform I'd earned through missions they'd never know about, watching them laugh at my presence while presenting my work as their own, it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I replayed every mission that had ended with a flag on a casket. Every operation we couldn't talk about, couldn't process, couldn't grieve properly because acknowledging the loss would mean acknowledging the mission existed. Every medal that never saw daylight, every commendation that stayed in classified files, every letter home that had to be vague enough not to compromise security. I thought about the operators I'd served with. Some were still active, still running missions in places I couldn't name. Some had transitioned to other roles, training the next generation or doing analytical work that kept them in the fight without putting them in harm's way. Some were dead, their names on memorial walls that the public would never see. We'd made a choice, all of us. We'd chosen to operate in the shadows, to let others take credit, to accept that our service would never be publicly acknowledged. And most of the time, that was fine. Most of the time, the mission was enough. But right now, in this moment, watching my work stolen and my presence mocked, I wondered if disappearing had been a mistake. If staying in the shadows too long made people forget who you were. If anonymity eventually became invisibility, and invisibility became irrelevance. The door opened. Lieutenant Parker stepped out, carrying a folder and looking at his phone. He nearly walked into me before he noticed I was there. "Oh, excuse me." He stepped around me without waiting for a response, still looking at his phone, and continued down the hallway. I watched him go. Young, confident, completely unaware that the woman he'd just brushed past had more combat deployments than he'd had performance reviews. More officers filed out. A few glanced at me. Most didn't. I was furniture to them, part of the building, something that existed in the background without requiring acknowledgement or thought. Colonel Harris was one of the last to leave. He saw me standing there and paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been concern if it weren't layered with condescension. "Captain Preston. Still here?" "Yes, sir." "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "I'm fine, sir." He studied me for a moment, then lowered his voice slightly. "Look, I don't know what your story is. I don't know what unit you're from or why you're here. But if you have legitimate concerns about this operation, bring them through proper channels. Don't disrupt briefings. Don't make accusations you can't substantiate. It reflects poorly on you and on whatever organization sent you." I could have told him. Right then, in that hallway, I could have explained exactly who I was and where the operational plan had come from. I could have provided documentation, confirmation codes, the names of supervisors who would verify my claims. But that would mean exposing networks that needed to stay hidden. It would mean pulling back the curtain on operations that were still running. It would mean compromising the very anonymity that made my work possible. So instead, I said, "Understood, sir." He nodded, satisfied that he'd handled the situation, and continued down the hallway. His footsteps echoed off the tile floor, fading as he turned the corner and disappeared. I stood alone in the corridor for another 5 minutes, staring at the photographs on the wall. Decades of naval history, preserved and honored and displayed for everyone to see. My history would never be there. My photograph would never hang on a wall. My name would never appear in a textbook or a memorial plaque or a history lesson. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was the price of doing work that actually mattered. But right now, it didn't feel fine. It felt like being erased. I turned away from the photographs and walked down the hallway toward the exit. Outside, the Virginia sun was bright and warm, the kind of spring afternoon that made it easy to forget there were places in the world where people were fighting and dying and trying to survive. I sat on a bench near the parking lot and watched personnel move between buildings. Officers in service dress, enlisted in utilities, civilians in business casual. All of them part of the machine, all of them playing their roles. I'd been part of that machine for a decade. I'd operated within it, served it, bled for it. And now I was sitting on a bench wondering if anyone would notice if I simply didn't show up tomorrow. They probably wouldn't. Not because they were cruel or deliberately disrespectful, but because in an organization this large, this complex, this focused on mission outcomes, individual operators became statistics. Numbers on a roster. Names in a database. And if you were a ghost, if your entire career was built on not being seen, then eventually, you became invisible even to yourself. The next morning, I showed up in the same uniform. No adjustments. No updated insignia. No attempt to make myself more visible or more acceptable to the officers who'd dismissed me the day before. I arrived early again, before the briefing room filled, and took the same seat at the far end of the table. The maps were still there, the projector still humming, the same box of donuts sitting on the side table with a few more missing. Officers filtered in gradually. Lieutenant Parker arrived with a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. The captain from yesterday came in deep in conversation with someone I didn't recognize. Colonel Harris arrived precisely at 08:55, tablet in hand, already reviewing something on the screen. None of them acknowledged me. I'd become part of the background again, a fixture that didn't require attention. At 0900, the door opened and Admiral Reeves entered. The room snapped to attention. He waved them down and moved to his seat, but this time, he didn't sit immediately. He stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the assembled officers, and then his eyes landed on me. He froze. Not obviously. Not in a way that anyone else would notice. But I saw it, the slight pause, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his attention sharpened and focused. He was looking at my right wrist. I'd rolled up my sleeves this morning, just slightly, just enough that the tattoo was visible beneath the edge of the fabric. A small, precise symbol that could have been decorative to anyone who didn't know better. But Admiral Reeves knew better. He stepped forward, moving past Colonel Harris without a word, and stopped directly in front of me. The room went silent. Every officer turned to watch. Captain Preston. Sir, where did you serve? His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something beneath it: recognition, surprise, maybe respect. I couldn't tell yet. I met his eyes. Task Force Green, sir. The silence in the room deepened. I heard someone shift in their chair. Someone else cleared their throat. But no one spoke. Reeves's gaze dropped to my wrist again, to the tattoo that marked me as one of the operators who didn't officially exist. When he looked back at my face, his expression had changed. Ghost 6? The question hung in the air. I didn't answer immediately. Didn't need to. He already knew. Yes, sir. He took a breath, then nodded once. I served with your unit commander. Operation Copper Canyon, 2016. I remembered Copper Canyon. It had been one of our most complex extractions, multiple targets, hostile territory, political complications that required coordination at levels far above my pay grade. Our unit commander had worked directly with several flag officers during that operation, building relationships that existed in classified files and nowhere else. I remember that operation, sir. Reeves glanced around the room, at the officers who were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning realization. His gaze settled on Colonel Harris. Colonel, do you know who Captain Preston is? Harris straightened. Sir, she's a liaison officer assigned through. She's the author of the operational plan you briefed yesterday. The room went completely still. Harris's face shifted through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, doubt, defensive anger. Sir, with respect, the plan was developed by my team over Colonel. Reeves's voice carried the kind of authority that ended conversations. I've read enough operational plans to recognize writing styles. I've also seen enough classified debriefs to know when work is being presented without proper attribution. Captain Preston wrote that plan. You presented it as your own. Harris opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sir, I wasn't aware. You weren't aware because you didn't ask. You saw a classified operation pushed through unconventional channels, and you assumed it was available for your use. It wasn't. Reeves turned back to me. Captain, you'll assume command of this operation effective immediately. Colonel Harris will serve in an advisory capacity. All personnel assignments will be reviewed and adjusted according to your operational requirements. I nodded. Yes, sir. Dismissed. The room emptied in less than 30 seconds. Officers grabbed folders and tablets and left without making eye contact with me or with each other. The silence they left behind was louder than their earlier laughter had been. Colonel Harris remained, standing near his seat, his face carefully neutral. Captain Preston. I didn't know. I stood, gathering the folder I'd brought. No, sir. You didn't. If I'd known you were, it wouldn't have mattered, sir. You saw someone who didn't fit your expectations, and you made assumptions. We all do. But in this case, Your assumptions were wrong. He didn't respond. After a moment, he nodded stiffly and left. I was alone in the briefing room with Admiral Reeves. He moved to the window, looking out at the base beyond, his hands clasped behind his back. Your unit commander spoke highly of you, he said without turning around. Said you were one of the best operational planners he'd ever worked with. Said you had a gift for seeing 3 steps ahead and planning for scenarios no one else considered. He was a good commander, sir. He also said you disappeared too much. That staying in the shadows was eating at you. I didn't answer immediately. Outside, personnel moved between buildings, vehicles pulled in and out of parking spaces. The routine operations of a military base continued without pause. The shadows are where the work gets done, sir. Sometimes. He turned to face me. But not always. And not forever. You can't operate effectively if no one knows who you are or what you're capable of. With respect, sir, that's exactly how I've been operating for 10 years. And how's that working out? The question landed heavier than I expected. I thought about the briefing room yesterday, about the laughter in the hallway, about the moment I'd wondered if disappearing had been a mistake. It's complicated, sir. It always is. He moved toward the door, then paused. The operation launches in 72 hours. You'll have full operational authority and whatever resources you need. Show them what Ghost Team can do when people actually know you're in the room. He left before I could respond. That night, I stayed alone in the hangar, checking equipment by hand. The space was vast and echoing, filled with pallets of gear waiting to be loaded onto transport aircraft. Communications equipment, tactical supplies, medical kits, everything we'd need for an operation that would officially never happen. I walked between the pallets with a clipboard, verifying inventory against the manifest I'd created 2 months ago. Most of it was correct, but there were small discrepancies, items requested but not delivered, substitutions made without consultation, quantities that didn't match the operational requirements. I made notes, corrections, adjustments. This was the work that no one saw, the unglamorous reality of operational planning. You could have the best strategy in the world, but if your team didn't have the right equipment at the right time, people died. Around 2200, Sergeant Mills appeared. He was the logistics NCO I'd noticed yesterday, watching quietly from the back of the briefing room. He'd been in the military long enough that his uniform had the faded quality of someone who'd seen real deployments, real missions, real consequences. Ma'am. He approached with the cautious respect of someone who'd figured out that I wasn't what I appeared to be. Need any help with the inventory? I'm good, Sergeant. Thank you. He nodded, but didn't leave. After a moment, he said, I served with a Delta team in Iraq. 2017, they had that same tattoo. I looked up from the clipboard. Just wanted to say, ma'am, it's good to have someone who knows what they're doing running this operation. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Sergeant. He left without another word, and I went back to the inventory. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, I wasn't suddenly vindicated or validated or any of the things people seemed to think mattered. But there was a recognition, small and quiet, from someone who understood the work. By 0100, I'd finished the equipment check and moved on to reviewing personnel files. The team that would deploy under my command, some I knew by reputation, some were completely unknown to me. I read through their records, their qualifications, their deployment histories. Looking for strengths I could leverage, weaknesses I'd need to account for, personalities that might clash under pressure. Lieutenant Parker was on the roster. Young, inexperienced in actual combat operations, but solid technical skills and high marks from training exercises. He'd need close supervision in the field, but he could learn if he was willing. Captain Delaney, the one who'd whispered about my clearances, had 3 deployments under his belt, all in relatively stable theaters. Competent but not exceptional. He'd follow orders as long as they made sense to him. Colonel Harris was listed as advisory personnel. I considered removing him entirely, but that would create political complications I didn't need. Better to keep him in a limited role where he couldn't interfere but could save face. I made notes on each file, building the mental map of how the team would function, who would work with whom, where the friction points would be. This was the part of command that no one talked about, the careful calibration of personalities and egos and capabilities that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Around 0300, my phone buzzed. A text from an encrypted number I recognized. Heard you came out of the shadows. How's the light? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, bright. Uncomfortable. Necessary. The response came immediately, good. Don't stay out too long. We still need ghosts. I set the phone down and returned to the files. The hangar was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional footstep of security personnel making their rounds. This was familiar, the late-night preparation, the solitary work, the knowledge that everything I did now would determine whether people came home alive. The difference was that this time, people knew I was doing it. This time, my name would be on the operational order. This time, when something went wrong, and something always went wrong, I couldn't disappear into the background and let someone else take the blame. Accountability worked both ways. You got credit for success, but you also owned the failures. By dawn, I'd reviewed every file, made preliminary team assignments, and identified 3 potential problems that would need to be addressed before deployment. I compiled everything into a brief report and sent it through secure channels to Admiral Reeves. His response came back within minutes, approved. Briefing at 0900. Bring coffee. I smiled slightly. At least some flag officers had a sense of humor. When I left the hangar, the sun was just starting to rise over the base. The sky was pale orange and pink, the kind of morning that felt clean and full of possibility. Personnel were beginning to move around, early shifts starting, night shifts ending, the perpetual rhythm of military life continuing without pause. Lieutenant Parker was walking toward the administrative building, still looking at his phone. When he saw me, he stopped, and for a moment I thought he might turn around and walk the other way. Instead, he approached. Captain Preston. Lieutenant. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I wanted to. I owe you an apology. For yesterday. The museum comment. I didn't know who you were. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to show them respect, Lieutenant. He winced. No, ma'am. You're right. I studied him for a moment. He was young, but there was something genuine in his discomfort. Not just embarrassment at being caught, but actual recognition that he'd been wrong. You're on the deployment roster, I said. Yes, ma'am. You'll be working directly under my command. I expect competence, professionalism, and the willingness to follow orders even when they don't make immediate sense to you. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Good. Briefing at 0900. Don't be late. I walked past him toward my quarters. Behind me, I heard him let out a breath he'd been holding. Respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. But sometimes it also had to be taught. The briefing at 0900 was different from the previous ones. The same room, the same people, but the atmosphere had shifted. Officers arrived on time, took their seats without excessive conversation, and waited in silence for Admiral Reeves to begin. When I entered, several of them stood. Not all. Colonel Harris remained seated, his expression carefully neutral, but enough that it was noticeable. Lieutenant Parker was one of them. So was Captain Delaney. I nodded acknowledgement and moved to the front of the room where the projector was already set up. My operational plan was loaded, ready to present, but this time with my name on the title slide. Admiral Reeves entered at precisely 0900. At ease. Captain Preston, you have the floor. I stepped forward and began. This was my plan, presented the way I'd written it, with the context and reasoning that had been stripped out when Colonel Harris presented it. I explained not just what we would do, but why, the intelligence that informed the strategy, the risk calculations that shaped the timelines, the contingencies that accounted for the 17 different ways the operation could go sideways. I spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. When I finished, Admiral Reeves leaned forward. Questions? Captain Delaney raised his hand. Ma'am, the extraction timeline seems tight. What happens if the target isn't at the primary location? We have 3 alternate locations identified based on pattern of life analysis and signals intelligence. Each has a separate extraction protocol. If the target isn't at any of the 4 locations, we abort and exfil according to contingency plan Delta. Which is... I clicked to the next slide, showing the abort procedures in detail. Immediate withdrawal to secondary rally point, encrypted communication to command, exfil by prepositioned air asset within 6 hours. Lieutenant Parker raised his hand next. The Phase 2 ground movement uses cover identities. What if local security forces challenge us? We have documentation prepared for 3 different cover stories, depending on which route we take. Primary cover is international aid workers. Secondary is journalists. Tertiary is commercial freight contractors. Each has supporting documentation, contact numbers, and background details that will hold up under casual inspection. And if it's not casual inspection, then we adapt. That's why I've built flexibility into the movement timeline, so we have options if the primary plan breaks down. More questions came. I answered each one, walking them through scenarios I'd already considered, problems I'd already solved, contingencies I'd already planned for. This was the depth that had been missing from Colonel Harris's presentation, the operational experience that came from actually running missions, not just reading about them. After an hour, Admiral Reeves called an end to questions. Captain Preston, your plan is approved. Deployment is authorized for 72 hours from now. Colonel Harris will coordinate logistics support. All personnel report to Captain Preston for final assignments by 1600 today. The room emptied more slowly this time. Several officers lingered to ask additional questions, to clarify details, to understand their specific roles. I answered patiently, making sure everyone understood not just what they were doing, but why it mattered. Colonel Harris approached last. Captain, I'll have the logistics coordination completed by 1400. Thank you, Colonel. He hesitated, then said, for what it's worth, your plan is excellent. I should have given credit where it was due. Yes, sir. You should have. He nodded and left. Sergeant Mills appeared in the doorway, waiting until the room was empty before entering. Ma'am, equipment manifest is finalized. Everything you requested will be ready for loading by tomorrow evening. Good work, Sergeant. One question, ma'am. The medical supplies. You've requested twice the standard allotment. Is there intelligence suggesting higher casualty risk? No. But I've learned that when you're operating in uncertain conditions, you plan for the worst-case scenario. If we don't need the extra supplies, we bring them home. If we do need them and don't have them, people die. He nodded, understanding immediately. I'll make sure everything is packed and ready. The rest of the day passed in the controlled chaos of final preparations. Personnel assignments were finalized, equipment was staged, communication protocols were reviewed and tested. I moved between meetings, briefings, and equipment checks with the efficiency that came from years of doing exactly this work. By 2200, I was back in my quarters, reviewing the operational order one final time before submitting it for Admiral Reeves's signature. Every detail accounted for, every contingency planned, every risk acknowledged and addressed. My phone buzzed. Another encrypted message. Heard you're leading the Norfolk Op. Good hunting, Ghost 6. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Ghost 6. A call sign I hadn't used in months, an identity I'd thought I'd left behind when I took on operational planning roles. But maybe you never really left the shadows. Maybe you just learned to move between light and darkness, using both as tools depending on what the mission required. Tomorrow, I'd brief the team one final time. The next day, we'd deploy. And 72 hours from now, we'd be in the field, executing the plan I'd written in a windowless room at Fort Bragg. This time, though, everyone would know who wrote it. Everyone would know who was leading it. And when we succeeded, because failure wasn't an option I planned for, my name would be on the mission report. Not for glory. Not for recognition. But because the work mattered, and the work deserved to be acknowledged. I closed the operational order and sent it through secure channels to Admiral Reeves. Then I turned off the light and tried to sleep. Weeks later, after the operation succeeded, one of the younger lieutenants approached me. We were back at Norfolk, in the same administrative building where I'd first been mocked, where my uniform had been judged and my presence questioned. Lieutenant Parker found me in the hallway outside the briefing room. He was in utilities this time, no longer the polished officer who'd made museum jokes. There was dust on his boots and a new wariness in his eyes that came from seeing how quickly clean operations could turn chaotic. "Ma'am." He stopped a respectful distance away. "Do you have a minute?" "What is it, Lieutenant?" He glanced around, making sure we were alone. "I wanted to say, I didn't know about who you were, about what you'd done. I know. That's not an excuse. I should have shown respect regardless. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what it means to operate the way you do. To make decisions when there's no clean answer and people's lives depend on getting it right." I studied him. During the operation, he'd performed well under pressure. When our primary extraction route was compromised and we'd had to adapt on the fly, he'd followed orders without hesitation, even when those orders meant moving through territory that hadn't been scouted and trusting my judgment over his own instincts. "You did good work out there," I said. "I had a good commander. You also had the discipline to follow instructions even when you didn't fully understand the reasoning. That's not common, especially among young officers who think they know better." He almost smiled. "I learned pretty quickly that I don't know better. Not compared to someone with your experience. Experience is just accumulated mistakes, Lieutenant. I've made plenty of them. The difference is that I've survived them and learned from them." He nodded, processing that. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why Delta? Why choose a path where no one knows what you've accomplished?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the years. The answer had evolved, changed shape depending on where I was in my career and what mission I'd just completed. "Because the work matters more than the recognition," I said. "Because keeping operations secure keeps operators alive. And because someone has to be willing to operate in the shadows so others can work in the light." He searched for words. "That's a hell of a sacrifice." "It's a choice, Lieutenant. We all make choices about what kind of service we want to give. Some people need the recognition. Some people need to know their work is visible and valued. There's nothing wrong with that. But some of us are wired differently. We need to know the work itself matters, regardless of who sees it." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, ma'am, for what you do, and for showing me what real leadership looks like." After he left, I stood alone in the hallway again. But this time, it felt different. Not invisible. Not erased. Just quiet. The photographs were still on the wall, decades of naval history, preserved and honored. My photograph wouldn't be there. My name wouldn't appear in the official records. But the work would survive, and the people I'd trained would carry forward what I'd taught them. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had always been enough. I turned away from the photographs and walked toward the exit. Outside, the Virginia afternoon was warm and clear, the kind of day that made it easy to forget there were still threats out there, still missions to run, still work to do. But I hadn't forgotten. I never forgot. That night, I received orders for my next assignment. Another operation, another mission that would officially never happen, another chance to work in the shadows and make sure someone else could stand in the light. I read the orders twice, memorizing the details, then deleted the message and began planning. Because that's what ghosts did. We operated, we adapted, we disappeared. And we came back when the work required it. No matter how bright the light got, there would always be shadows. And someone had to be willing to move through them. Months later, I was back at Fort Bragg, watching new recruits run the obstacle course. The North Carolina heat was oppressive, summer humidity that made every breath feel thick and heavy. The recruits struggled through the course with the determination of people who hadn't yet learned that determination alone wasn't enough. I stood in the shade of a building, clipboard in hand, taking notes on their performance. This was part of my current assignment, evaluating potential candidates for advanced training, identifying the ones who had not just the physical capability, but the mental flexibility that special operations required. One of them caught my attention. A young soldier, maybe 23, running the course with efficiency rather than raw speed. He wasn't the fastest, but he was analyzing each obstacle as he approached it, adjusting his technique, conserving energy for the more difficult sections ahead. When he finished, breathing hard but not gasping, I called him over. "Name?" "Private First Class Marcus Chin, ma'am." You run that course often? 3 times a week, ma'am. Your time is improving? Yes, ma'am. Shaved 12 seconds off my best time this month. I made a note on the clipboard. You analyze obstacles before you tackle them. That's good. But you hesitate slightly on the wall climb. Why? He blinked, surprised that I'd noticed. I'm still working on upper body strength, ma'am. The hesitation is me calculating whether I have enough momentum to clear it in one movement or if I need to adjust midway. And? Usually need to adjust. So eliminate the hesitation. Commit to the adjustment from the start. Make it part of your approach rather than a correction. You'll save time and energy. Yes, ma'am. I looked at him more carefully. You interested in advanced training? Yes, ma'am. That's the goal. It's a long road. Physically demanding, mentally exhausting, and there's no guarantee of success even if you make it through selection. I understand, ma'am. Do you? I held his gaze. Because the hardest part isn't the physical training. It's accepting that you might do extraordinary work and never receive recognition for it. That you might serve with honor and sacrifice and no one outside your unit will ever know. Can you handle that? He didn't answer immediately, which I respected. Too many young soldiers gave quick, confident answers without actually thinking about what they were committing to. Finally, he said, "Ma'am, I joined because I wanted to serve. Not because I wanted people to thank me for it. If doing the real work means staying quiet about it, I can handle that." I nodded and made another note. Report to Building C, 7 tomorrow at 0600. Bring your PT gear and be ready to work. Yes, ma'am. He started to leave, then turned back. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, that tattoo on your wrist. I've seen it before. On an instructor last year. He said it meant something specific, but he wouldn't say what. I glanced at my right wrist, where the small symbol was visible beneath my watch. It means you did the work and earned the right to wear it. That's all you need to know for now. Yes, ma'am. After he left, I continued watching the course. More recruits struggling through obstacles, pushing their bodies to the limit, learning what they were capable of when everything hurt and quitting seemed easier than continuing. This was where it started, not with the dramatic operations or the classified missions, but with young soldiers deciding whether they wanted to do hard work in obscurity or easier work in visibility. Both paths had value. Both paths required sacrifice. But only one path led to the shadows, and only certain people were suited for that journey. A familiar voice spoke behind me. Still recruiting for the Ghost Factory? I turned. Master Sergeant David Cole, one of my former teammates from Task Force Green. He'd retired from active operations 2 years ago and now worked as a senior instructor, training the next generation of operators. Someone has to, I said. He moved to stand beside me, watching the recruits with the practiced eye of someone who'd run this course 1,000 times. Heard about Norfolk. You made quite an impression. I made people uncomfortable. There's a difference. Maybe. But sometimes making people uncomfortable is how you force change. Can't stay invisible forever, Lena. It was strange hearing my first name. In the field, I'd been Ghost 6 for tasked. Consulting. Advisory roles. Making sure the new ghosts don't repeat our mistakes. That's a full-time job. He laughed. Yeah, it is. He paused, then said more seriously, we lost Martinez last month. Beirut operation that went bad. You probably heard. I had. Martinez had been with Ghost Team for 6 years, a solid operator who specialized in technical infiltration. The official story was he died in a training accident. The real story was classified and would stay that way. I heard, I said quietly. His family got the flag and the condolences and the vague explanations. They'll never know what he really did or why it mattered. They know he served with honor. That's what matters. Is it? Cole turned to face me. I'm not saying we should declassify everything or break operational security. But at some point, Lena, the silence becomes its own kind of burden. We carry all this history, all these sacrifices, and we can't share it with anyone. That weight adds up. I thought about Norfolk, about the moment Admiral Reeves recognized my tattoo and everything changed. About the brief period where people knew who I was and what I'd accomplished. He was right. It had felt different. Lighter in some ways. But also more complicated, more exposed, more vulnerable. The weight is part of the job, I said. So is knowing when to set it down. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. An encrypted message with coordinates and a timeline. Another mission, another operation that would require someone who knew how to work in the shadows. Cole saw my expression change. You're being called back in. Looks like it. You going to go? I looked at the recruits on the obstacle course, at Private First Class Chin finishing his second run of the day, at the endless cycle of training and preparation that fed operators into the machine. Yeah, I said. I'm going. One of these days, you're going to have to decide whether you want to stay a ghost or step into the light permanently. Can't do both forever. Maybe not. But I can do both for now. He nodded, understanding. Be safe out there, Ghost 6. Always am. I watched him walk away, then looked down at my wrist where the tattoo marked me as someone who'd chosen this path. No name, no branch, no glory. Just the mark of those who did what others couldn't. A new recruit approached the obstacle course, young and determined and completely unaware of the road ahead. He looked at the first obstacle, calculated his approach, and launched himself forward. I smiled. Because for all the noise, all the politics, all the people who never saw me coming, my legacy had already outlived their laughter. It was there in the recruits who wore the same tattoo. In the missions that succeeded because someone had planned them correctly. In the operators who came home alive because someone had thought 3 steps ahead and prepared for the scenarios no one else considered. My name wouldn't be on memorial walls or in history books. My photograph wouldn't hang in administrative hallways. My service would remain classified long after I was gone. But the work would survive. The legacy would continue. And somewhere, in rooms I'd never see, operators I'd never meet would run missions I'd helped plan and come home safely because someone had been willing to stay in the shadows. That was enough. That had always been enough. I turned away from the obstacle course and walked toward the administrative building where my next assignment waited. The North Carolina sun was bright overhead, but I was already thinking about the shadows, where they were, how to move through them, and what work needed to be done there. Because that's what ghosts did. We operated in the darkness so others could stand in the light. And we did it without expecting anyone to notice. I left Fort Bragg 3 days later with orders that took me back overseas. The mission was straightforward on paper, provide operational consultation for a joint task force operation in Eastern Europe. In reality, it meant going back into the field, back into the work that had defined the last decade of my life. The flight was long, multiple connections through cities I couldn't name in reports, traveling under documentation that would disappear from databases within 72 hours of mission completion. I sat in economy seats, surrounded by civilians who had no idea that the woman reading a paperback novel next to them had spent years operating in places their governments claimed didn't exist. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I thought about what Cole had said. About choosing between staying a ghost and stepping into the light permanently. About whether the weight of silence eventually became too much to carry. He wasn't wrong. The weight was real. Every classified mission, every operator lost, every sacrifice that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, it accumulated over time, settling into your bones until you forgot what it felt like to move without it. But I'd also seen what happened when operators stepped into the light too soon, when they tried to translate shadow work into something visible and public. They struggled. Not because they weren't capable, but because the skills that made you effective in the darkness didn't always transfer to daylight operations. In the shadows, you learn to trust your instincts, to make decisions with incomplete information, to adapt when everything went wrong. You learned that failure meant people died and success meant silence. There were no press conferences, no medals ceremonies, no public validation that you'd done something that mattered. That created a specific kind of operator. Someone who didn't need external recognition to know their work had value. Someone who could carry the weight of classified operations without needing to share it. Someone who understood that the mission was bigger than any individual contribution. I'd become that person. I'd chosen it, trained for it, lived it for so long that I wasn't sure I knew how to be anything else. When the plane landed, I was met by a liaison officer who handed me an envelope without speaking. Inside were new credentials, a mission brief, and coordinates for a safe house where I'd receive final instructions. The safe house was in a residential neighborhood, the kind of place that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Inside, 3 other operators were waiting, 2 I recognized from previous missions, 1 I'd never seen before. We didn't use names. Call signs only, and even those were temporary, assigned for this specific operation and discarded afterward. For the next 2 weeks, I was Nomad 7. The mission itself was complex but familiar. Extract a high-value intelligence asset from a location that officially didn't have any Western military presence. Move through territory controlled by forces that would execute us if they discovered who we were. Deliver the asset to a secure location and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. We spent 4 days planning, running scenarios, identifying every possible point of failure, and building contingencies. The other operators were good, experienced, professional, capable of the kind of improvisation that kept you alive when the plan broke down. On the 5th day, we deployed. Low-altitude insertion just after midnight, moving through terrain that was simultaneously familiar and alien. I'd operated in similar environments before, but every mission had its own unique challenges, its own specific variables that couldn't be predicted from a briefing room. The extraction itself went smoothly for the first 6 hours. We reached the target location, made contact with the asset, and began moving toward the exfil point using the route I'd planned. The asset was frightened but cooperative, understanding that his survival depended on following our instructions exactly. Then, 3 kilometers from the exfil point, everything changed. A patrol we hadn't anticipated, moving through an area that was supposed to be clear. We had maybe 30 seconds to adapt before they spotted us. I made the call. Redirect to alternate route, increase pace, prepare for possible contact. The other operators responded immediately, adjusting formation without question, trusting my judgment because that's what you did in the field. You trusted the person in command to make the right decision with incomplete information. We moved through darkness, navigating by GPS and instinct, the asset between us, every sense heightened to the point where I could hear my own heartbeat over the sound of boots on rough ground. Behind us, voices called out. The patrol had found something, maybe our tracks, maybe just a disturbance that didn't feel right to them. We reached the alternate exfil point with 4 minutes to spare. The helicopter was already inbound, and we secured the perimeter while waiting for extraction. The asset was shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with fear, but he stayed quiet and followed instructions. When the helicopter appeared, it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. We loaded the asset, confirmed headcount, and lifted off just as the first patrol members reached visual range of the exfil point. Inside the helicopter, no one spoke. We didn't celebrate, didn't congratulate each other, didn't do anything except breathe and start the mental process of compartmentalizing what had just happened. The mission wasn't over until we delivered the asset to the secure location and confirmed that all personnel were accounted for. That happened 6 hours later. The asset was transferred to handlers I'd never meet, given protection and a new identity that would let him disappear into a life far from the danger he'd escaped. We were debriefed separately, our reports compiled into files that would be classified at levels most military personnel would never access. 72 hours after that, I was back on a plane, traveling under different documentation, heading toward another temporary assignment in another location I couldn't discuss. This was the rhythm of ghost work. Deploy, execute, debrief, disappear. Move between missions without pause, without time to process or reflect or question whether the weight was becoming too heavy. But somewhere over the Atlantic again, heading back toward the United States, I realized something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would change everything immediately. But I'd felt it during the mission, in that moment when I'd made the call to redirect and the other operators had followed without hesitation. I'd felt the weight of command, of responsibility, of being the person whose decisions determined whether everyone came home alive. And I'd also felt something else. Recognition. Not public recognition or medals or press conferences, but the recognition that came from operators who understood what you were doing and why it mattered. The acknowledgement that existed in the silence between professionals who'd both been downrange and knew what it cost. That was different from invisibility. Different from being dismissed or mocked or ignored. It was the kind of recognition that actually mattered, that came from people whose opinions were earned through shared experience rather than granted through rank or position. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what Cole had been trying to tell me. Not that I needed to step fully into the light, but that I could exist somewhere between shadow and visibility. That I could do the classified work while also accepting the quiet recognition of those who understood what that work required. The plane landed at dawn. I collected my bag and walked through an airport full of people starting their normal days, heading to normal jobs, living normal lives that didn't include midnight extractions or classified debriefs or the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared. I envied them sometimes. But only sometimes. Because for all the weight, for all the silence, for all the sacrifices that would never be publicly acknowledged, I knew what I was doing mattered. I knew the work saved lives and prevented threats and made the world marginally safer even if no one outside a small circle would ever know. And I knew that somewhere, in rooms I'd never see, operators I'd never meet would benefit from the lessons I'd learned, the missions I'd run, the legacy I was building one classified operation at a time. My phone buzzed. Another message, another mission, another chance to work in the shadows. I read it twice, then deleted it and started planning. Because that's what ghosts did. And I was very good at being a ghost. That's where I drew the line, and it changed the mission and the room. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true boundary-setting stories. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had your work presented without your name on it? What did you do? Been judged by your appearance, title, or uniform before you spoke? How did you respond? Where's the line between staying humble and letting people walk over you? If you were in my seat when the Admiral recognized the tattoo, what would you have said? Do you think quiet excellence or visible credit builds better leaders? Drop your story in the comments. Someone here needs to read it.